Hello and welcome. Just introducing you, we have a panel here to talk about a blog post that we launched last week called I'm Not Diversity. And the introduction to that blog post was something that happened to me in September on a Zoom call. I had a call with a guy who was interested in non-exec work, and he started the call by saying, so great to speak to you. I know I'm not diversity, but I'd love to talk to you about. And so I stopped him and said, what do you mean by I'm not diversity? That actually doesn't make sense. And how can you not be diversity? Diversity is relative. And we got into a discussion about that. And it left me with a lot of thoughts about the diversity word and the work that's being done to improve diversity on boards. And I think we need to talk about it more, about the language we're using and the thoughtfulness within this. So here joining me today, I'm Sarah Pearman and I'm the CEO of Dynamic Boards, and I've got my co-founder Scarlett Brown here, Dr. Scarlett Brown. She is a self-professed governance geek. Then I've got, going around bottom left, Kieran Moynihan, and Kieran is the managing partner of Board Excellence, and he does lots of board evaluations with AIM and Ftse businesses, and he's a fantastic writer on all things board related. And bottom right here, we've got Tony Simpson. Tony is a board advisor and partner at Savannah Group, and we met Tony right at the beginning of this journey to create dynamic boards, and he's been cheering us on from the start. Thank you, Tony. So to kick us off, I guess the word diversity, has it become ironically exclusive and narrow, and sort of what's missing from that?
I think, Sarah, I think your article really highlighted the fact that there's been such a focus on diversity and particularly on gender and female diversity on boards that we've almost lost track of what we're really trying to achieve in terms of that mix, what you outlined on boards. And that while it's been very understandable that the focus has been on gender diversity, I think a lot of boards are starting to realize now it's far more than just gender. It's around age, it's thinking style, it's sector background, just that, all that mix of different insights and experiences and perspectives. And as we evaluate boards day to day, when we look at the really strong progressive boards, there's a great mix around the table of all different perspectives. And I think particularly now, as we're in such a challenging environment for the vast majority of boards, that's really important. And now more than ever, and we're starting even to see in the last couple of months of the COVID-19 crisis, a number of boards start to realize that the current composition and mix really isn't what they need for the coming years.
Yeah, I think if I can just add to that, you know, the gentleman who said I'm not diverse, am I diverse, is actually mirroring what's going on in society in many ways. And you know, I as somebody of colour have an inkling of you know, got the word actually, but support in terms of what he's saying, because it's quite lazy of chairmen sometimes to say we now need to have diversity as if they're ticking a box and doing something, because they're putting the onus on the candidates rather than the chairman or the CEO themselves. And the value of a board is to represent not only its shareholders but also to be best positioned for that organisation to take advantage of the market it's in. And so by having as broader thinking base, to Kieran's point, as possible is really important. So somebody coming in saying I'm not diverse is not getting the right message, and the right message is diversity is cognitive in many ways. It's how people think, it's where they live, it's class, and putting it down to race, gender, and ethnicity is missing the point. You know, a board is a collection of people. But here's the thing: in order to have a board that is truly diverse, you need a chairman and a CEO who's emotionally secure. And I would argue a lot of them aren't.
And that actually, Tony has highlighted there, Sarah, one of the biggest challenges of all actually is the mindset of board chairs and nomination committees. I wrote recently about, I coined this phrase of preservationist board chair. And a lot of times when you see boards that are really struggling in terms of their mix, and you look kind of under the bonnet, you see a board chair who's really resistant to the idea of younger, different, obviously gender mix, ethnic mix, sector background and things like that. And that's still probably one of the biggest challenges. And Tony sees it obviously in placing board directors as well, and you see it, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and I think what COVID-19 crisis has highlighted as well is that business is more and more challenging. And I think a lot of progressive boards we see that having a real vibrant mix of different thinking styles and perspectives is just good business for the organization and ultimately improves their decision making. So I think that's a big message we're trying to get out there.
Where do you guys think that comes from in terms of the behaviour for the chair? Is it risk aversion? Is it reluctance to do something different? Is it, you know, something embedded within the way that boards are set up, that they're nervous about change? Or
No, actually, it's an interesting one. I think it comes from it's a generational thing. I think chairmen have got people who've had a career that started, might have been on the factory floor, worked all the way up to the main office, have a sense of entitlement that doesn't exist anymore. So a company I would argue, is an organic thing. It's not owned by anybody. It's owned by the world in which it lives and should live. But I think a lot of chairmen feel that they want to preserve their status in terms of what they're doing, and they're using people like myself and actually Kieran to understand the diversity and inclusion dynamic, and then they're using their life skill to understand how they can preserve their position within that space without saying the real thing that happens. Say, actually, if I truly believe this, I think we need to change everything, including myself, because I don't have the lived experience to take this organization where it needs to be. Now, that's a very brave thing to do, and it's a very brave thing to say, but actually, you know, if they have the best interests of the business at heart and they are well rewarded, and to be fair to them, the remuneration committees and the trustees and the other stakeholders in an organization should be the people who provide that safe space for that chairman or CEO to have that conversation. They should reward them for that as well. Because we're not asking people to fall on their sword, but you know, the world is changing, and to Kieran's point, the acceleration of COVID in terms of how people work, the type of leadership people need now is totally different. In 6 months, we've gone from an organization where you need the status of a corner office, a car park, and your big car in front of the building to make everyone know that's the boss, to all working everywhere. Nobody cares anymore. So what does leadership mean?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Another aspect, Scarlett, that's a real challenge as well. It's just a practical aspect, and Tony alluded to it there. The average age of Ftse board directors is 62, right? So that just gives you a sense that we're still in quite a legacy mindset where the average age of board directors on not just companies, but large charity and other types of organizations is still very high. And I think Sarah referred to it in her article in a very interesting way about just multi-generational boards. And the world has changed, and you now have, like, if you go back 20 or 30 years, that non-executive board directors were normally retired. So they retired from their executive work. So that meant automatically they were in their late 50s and 60s, and then they went on to become board directors. Now you have people in their late 30s, early 40s who've had an incredible career, incredible leadership and responsibilities, who at 37 or 41 decide to step back from the executive world, have incredible value to add to a board of directors, but I can tell you, find it extremely difficult to be selected because there's such a default position around, you know, someone in their 50s, 60s in some respects is more suitable and has more experience.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Kieran. This is a side discussion, but I met a lady who is in her mid-50s, and she said when she was 50, she went to search and said, look, I'm interested in the board role. And they said, oh, not sure, you're a bit young, not sure you've got enough experience. And she said, okay, well, I've started a business and sold it to an AIM company. I've been on the board of a Ftse company. I've done this, I've done that and the other. What the heck more do you want me to do? And there was a challenge there of just, some of this is perception, it's not reality. There's people who are incredibly board ready, but there's a perception that they're not our board type that we've got used to. But one of the things that you made me think of is, and maybe this is too generous, I don't know, but this is where my head's going at the moment. Is it an awkward time to be a chair, especially as a white man on those boards? Because when I've looked at sort of my career and the women on boards movement, it hasn't been the gender mix on boards movement. It's been the women on boards movement. And actually, the men have not been part of that movement. And I think there's often an afterthought of we should invite men to these events as well. But it's actually quite awkward to suddenly invite the group that you've been talking about that haven't been included at a later date. And I wondered whether this sort of male stale pale rhetoric and that like has actually disengaged a group from this discussion that really need to be engaged with it.
I think, Sarah, what happened, and it was very understandable that organisations like Women on Boards and others, I think because there was such a gender problem on UK boards and listed company boards, I think it was very understandable that there had to be such a focus on by so many different advocacy groups and the government and their reports or whatever. But I think we're now at a point where, as the world is evolving, that whole trust needs to broaden. That it's not just about a gender anymore. It's not just about age and ethnic background and sector background, right? But it's around representing the customers, the broader stakeholders as well. So I think what I fully understand why all the focus has been on female board diversity up to now, because I think unfortunately it was needed. It was such a problem. But I think we're at the stage now where we need to think far more holistically around a board of directors that genuinely has that very broad range of thinking styles. But increasingly, I'm seeing a lot of boards start to realize as well that they're looking at their customers and their customer demographics, and they're looking at themselves on the board and say, do we really understand our customers? Do we represent our customers? So I think the time has come now for a far broader discussion.
I think that we can sometimes forget how some of those parts of the movement were really important for getting on the conversation. Like, it's amazing how quickly we've gone from the idea that boards should not be all male or anything, and the Women on Boards movement being a kind of pressure group to now becoming accepted within all of the codes we see that diversity is an important part of good governance. And we know that now, there's much more discussion around that. So I feel like it's more about how do we build on that opportunity and take it forward. And there's something really challenging when it comes to changing policy in any area. The reason why phrases like male, pale and stale had the kind of the legitimacy that they did, and that thing that came out, I think it was while I was doing my PhD on this work around, there's more people called John on boards than there are women, and that got loads of thing in the press, and it was because it was the kind of thing that my mum could understand. Like, you don't need to understand what a board does or what governance is to get that that's probably a bad thing. So there's something about some of the phrases and those things that have become kind of repeated in this sort of relationship with diversity we have. But it's moving on from that and saying, okay, well, that was a really effective movement at the time. But my concern is that some of those, because it was such a kind of, we had the big Women on Boards movement, and then we had the Parker Review, that some particularly smaller companies or organisations that are newer to the diversity conversation feel like they have to go in that same order, and they have to do the same, like, right, we need to sort our gender diversity out, and then maybe we need to think about getting a person of colour, and then maybe we'll think about other kinds of diversity, rather than using it as a kind of an opportunity to make a kind of double jump and say, actually, rather than starting with women and working to other kinds of diversity, let's start with the holistic, broader concept of diversity. And this is the point you've made before, Sarah, about starting with yourself and saying what works for this board, this organisation. What do our stakeholders look like? Are we consumer facing? What do our consumers look like? And therefore, what kind of skills, experiences and perspectives do we need? But I think maybe it's also back to that chair thing. Organisations get afraid and they say, we've got to do diversity, let's start with a woman, and all they do is add, it would be great if this person was a woman, onto the end of the skills they were looking for anyway. And it's not, really engaging with what diversity means.
Or they don't add it to it, and they just pretend that they don't have any particular perspective they're looking for, and then most of the people that apply don't even get looked at, which I think is.
But I think it does start, to your point, Scarlett. Unfortunately, it stops and starts with the chair, because let's go back to the 30% club and women on boards. And I love the sign. There's more people called John than women on boards. The problem is, as a woman to get onto a board, there was a time when you had to become like a man. So actually, were you getting diversity? Well, no, you weren't actually. You were getting women who behaved like men and had careers like men. That's not diverse either. And actually, when you go back onto race and by the way, there's many shades of black as there are many shades of white, onto boards. You get people who behave. If you behave like the people interviewing you, you tend to get the job. But this doesn't, to Kieran's point, give you the diversity that you need for that board. So you can have a board that is female, visually diverse, and actually but age diverse. But if they've all been to Millfield and Ampleforth and to Durham, trust me, they're not diverse.
Yeah, well, they could all be accountants.
Actually, that over 70% of most, the vast majority of boards are from a financial background.
Yeah.
Right? And my wife's an accountant, so I totally get it in terms of the skill sets they bring. But the reality, it points back to this legacy model of how boards, people think about boards. Whereas if we get to the day where a board is put together and it ends up having 3 members of colour because 2 of them are heavyweight sector experts who seriously move the needle in terms of strategy for the organisation and company, and there happens to be 2 women, and there happens to be 3 of them in their 30s, and no one blinks because they just think that's an outstanding high calibre board.
Exactly.
That's when we get to the day where we're not talking about diversity or mix, because people just see that, why on earth would you do anything other than that?
Yeah, I've heard people say that we won't have achieved equality until there's as many average women on boards as there are average men, which is a very negative way of saying what you've just said, Kieran, is there's something really brilliant that we're aspiring towards here. And until we have those brilliant people and it's normal, then we won't have achieved it.
And Sarah, one thing that is important for us as well to keep in context here is that, a lot of we're talking about the boards that are visible. So I mean the boards that are on the Ftse and the AIM and large high profile organisations, and a lot of those boards have been pressurised into adding female board members by institutional investors and things like that. But there's tens of thousands of other boards of private companies, of charities, of all different public sector and all different type things like that, that they need some help as well in terms of inspiring them to see the benefits of a truly great mix on the boards. While it's very understandable that a lot of the attention in the media is around the Ftse and AIM and publicly visible companies, there's tens of thousands of more boards that need help in this area.
I think most of the time, I think the attention's there because there's data.
Yeah.
Much, much harder to get the data on the rest. So what you end up doing is hearing anecdotal stories, and that gives you a sense of where other boards are at. It would be incredible if we could have board level data on great SME Britain. We would find out a lot if we could do that.
Yeah, and I think the oxygen created by dynamic and dynamic boards, but by dynamic and young
Thanks,
boards.
Tony.
You didn't even have to pay for that one. Thanks,
It's
Tony.
really important, because I wanted to make a point earlier that Kieran made, and here's a piece of research that should be done. I was lucky enough to spend 8 years of my life living in the Middle East. And so I worked with lots and lots of family businesses. And I can tell you now, there's not a single family business that I came across that had thrived after 3 or 4 generations. And so you need to ask yourself, why is that? And that is going back to diversity and inclusion. So 2 things happen. One is the uncle becomes the accountant and they start to use it over familiarity and they're all the same. And the other thing is the lived experience of the family, the people in that organization, versus a company that sets up with people from different parts of the world, etc. So there's a piece of work to be done there, because it's impossible. And I think if you were to look at how humans naturally behave in our psychology, I think it's over 150 people is the optimum amount you can lead a group and know his name and whatever and sustain it. So if we keep that in mind in terms of how a company works, and let's agree, which I think is right, that every organization should have a purpose over and above making a profit, because that's another reason why companies don't go that. We need to have a leadership who understand from a human perspective and intrinsically understand that. And what we're talking about here with businesses is a human-driven leadership rather than rather than led by rote, which is all the problems we've got now, which is why we've got the issue with chairman looking to tick boxes and hire people in and relying on the Parker Review actually, and relying on 30% Club, and relying on third parties to tell them how to do their job, which is frankly laughable if they're being paid the money with the skills that they've got to do that job.
Yeah, I wonder whether some of this is about a lot of the time they're being told what they need to do, whether that's from an actual review or from just pressure from the public. Whereas actually what we need to do more of is inspire. And if we can inspire people to recognise, like Kieran was talking about multi-generational boards, recognise how unbelievably beneficial it would be if you had people that understood what your customers were thinking because they were like your customer group or your future customer group, so they could see where this is headed, or perhaps your employees, like to understand your employee base better. And if we get people to sort of get on the journey of feeling like that is where they want to go because they can see the benefit it will bring, then that is more compelling than giving them a sense that you've got another box you have to tick now.
Yeah, that's definitely, Sarah, as well. I think there's a window, COVID-19 has brought a window of opportunity that a lot of boards are soul searching a bit. So I had insights into a board a couple of months ago in the absolute height of the crisis in COVID-19, where their sector was devastated and the board got stuck trying to figure out new business models, because a lot of the business models required serious digital transformation, and there was no one around the board table of 9, I think 8 men and 1 woman, average age 58, I'd say, right? None of them had any technology expertise, and this company had to make a serious transformation to far more digital type delivery to their customers. They really didn't understand the customers, a lot of whom were younger demographics, and the board eventually came to the crossroads where they've now had to add 2 board members, and they asked 2 of the long-serving board members to step down. But the average age has come down. All of a sudden they have a heavyweight technology expert that's really transforming the board. So there's definitely, I think, a window where a lot more boards are starting to just soul search a bit as regards, we have such a challenging couple of years ahead. Do we really have the right skill sets and mix and real range of thinking styles around the board table to help us navigate through this?
I think it's to Tony's point as well, that actually not only has it done that in terms of particularly the move to digital. I mean, there's no organisation really that hasn't been affected by COVID-19 in a move to a kind of a more digital strategy, even if it's just having people working from home, or even in kind of manufacturing and that kind of thing, having to work out different relationships. But also that it has put leadership really under a kind of microscope, and the kinds of leadership that is working right now through this kind of crisis are the more human versions of leadership. Like, we not only do we need different boards and we need different strategies, we also need totally different kinds of leadership, and that's not just at a board level. That exists throughout the organization, and if there's anything we can be optimistic about this year, which in 2020 optimism is difficult on almost every level, but the idea that we might be thinking totally differently about what an organization is, what is a company, what is our relationship with our consumers, and everybody has to be a bit more human, not least of all because I'm taking 95 to 98% of my meetings in my living room, or so there's a kind of we all have to be a bit more human, and actually if that is as true within a board as it is within any team.
Sorry, go for it then.
I was going to say, I think early next year there'll be some huge fallouts in terms of senior leadership. I've witnessed town halls and Zoom meetings with chairmen and CEOs of companies talking to their staff, where most of the staff under 40 are wincing because what's happening is this has created more face time with leadership rather than less. So people are actually now seeing how their CEOs and their C-suites are behaving and witnessing it firsthand and thinking, why am I working here when they don't think and feel like I do? And with 50% of the world's population under 25 outside of Europe, and companies looking for a global footprint, Where we have boards, as to Kieran's point, who are average age of 57 to 67, it's done, it's over. So how do you behave and operate with young companies who have just a fresher and more challenging and more holistic approach to business? And the final thing is, companies don't do business with companies, they do business with people, do business with people. Yeah. And that's becoming more and more acute now, because you can't rely on your fancy office and your great brochure on your deck. You click a button and there's somebody in front of you, and that's it, that's the pitch.
Yeah.
The words that come out of your mouth suddenly matter all the more.
Yeah, I was going to say, Sarah, one of the other challenges as well, and I think Tony alluded to it there, is the culture and values of organizations. And I think there's, particularly for listed companies in the UK, there's been a massive focus in the last 2 years on environment, social and governance, and ESG, and a real hot topic. But a lot of people are now starting to see that what's really behind ESG is the culture and the commitment of the organization to do the right thing. And I think a lot of boards are starting to realize that, well, we should really set the example and the tone for this organization. So you're starting to see boards realize they're not in the ivory tower anymore, that's somehow disconnected from the rest of the organization, that they really need to walk the talk in terms of their value set and culture. And I think because of that, that's another factor that people are starting to really realize that, it's no point talking about in your glossy annual report about how committed you are to ESG and things like that. And on the next page, you're looking at the board of directors saying, doesn't quite match the rhetoric. So I think that's another trend that will grow as well.
I wonder if it might be worth going around and saying, what would your message be to chairs, like from this conversation? Because one of the thoughts on what you're both saying is, go there. Like if this is somewhere you haven't been before, where you're honestly looking at your board and talking about the skill sets you've got around the board, the perspectives, the lived experience, how you can represent your employees' views, your customer views. If you haven't gone there and thought about that before, then go there. Like spend some time, get some external help if you need it, but invest effort in trying to understand that. And that will probably mean talking to other people and hearing their perspectives on your board. And I think there's a lot of boards that haven't gone there yet. And that's a big step. But actually it's brave, courageous leadership. If that's the first time you've done that and it's going to be really transformational for the business, that's what a confident leader will do. Don't be defensive and don't think that what this means is ticking the next box. You need to go there.
And that really sums up, Sarah, and I think one of the important things I'd say why Tony and I have been excited to support dynamic boards is just this leveling of the playing field of the universe of potential board directors, that it's in the UK, Ireland and across the world, there is such a narrow pool that board chairs keep going back to, and is trying to break out of that cycle to open up their minds to say, it's now 2020, the world is changing by the hour almost, there's so much going on, that to really look in terms of when you're thinking about the skill sets and mix on the board, to really open up the mind to think differently. And the fact that there's an awful lot of candidate board directors who may not have been a board director yet, but have all the attributes to be an outstanding board director with a little bit of training, and just to move away from this of, we need to go to someone who has 25 years board experience. A lot of those people with 25-year board experience doesn't automatically translate that they're outstanding high caliber board directors. Right? That's the reality of all of us in our profession, right? There is a wide mix, whereas the opposite is true, where you could have some first-time board directors who just hit the ball out of the park in terms of their insights, their wisdom, their judgment, just their ethic, their work ethic, to really add value to the board. So I think for me, the key advice to the board chairs is just to open up the minds to the potential different sets of potential board directors who could really freshen and add a lot of unique perspectives and insights for the board.
And just to expanding on what you just said, Kieran, like the potential non-exec market is huge. It isn't the same as an executive job. It's not a full-time job. So you could have someone that's in an executive role and does one non-exec role alongside that. And increasingly organizations are in favor of that because they recognize it's going to help them retain great people and give them other experiences, which will in turn benefit their full-time role. So the scope is huge.
Yes.
You know, there's literally the entire market.
Yeah, ultimately, you know, you can envisage a society where people have a poly career and everybody should be a non-exec on a board, because we all are responsible for each other, you know, and so therefore it will be a level playing field, and businesses should be able to react and respond accordingly. And I think it's more enriching for the organization. And to your question about the chairman, I think in terms of what they should do, I think it's they have a duty of care actually to do their job properly, to understand about climate change, to understand about sustainability, to understand about the inclusion and diversity, because all of this is part of their job now, whether they like it or not. And more importantly, it's not something you can abdicate to HR, but it's something that, you know, if you're a people business, which every organization is, it's your business, it's our business. So I think my answer to a chairman would be that we need to provide a safe space to have that conversation. That's what we need to do.
I mean, I would completely agree with both of you. I think, again, going back to the point before, you know, one of the things I'm optimistic about, but also that I would advise anybody is that you know, not seeing diversity as start with gender and work forward and take that double jump. But it requires more work. Like, it does require a bit more work. That, you know, finding a woman who has the experience that you were looking for already in a man, or finding, you know, that's a slightly easy task. Finding a person of colour with the experience you were expecting from a white man is a more difficult task. But, you know, rethinking what it is that you're actually looking for on a much broader definition of diversity. Not only, yes, it is a more difficult task, but it's also a much more interesting one than just giving a requirement to, you know, out into the ether or to a search consultant or similar, saying just find me somebody that ticks all these boxes. It's a much more interesting conversation, but I think requires boards in general to have a much more reflective response to what it is they're doing, and to get out of the habit of just picking you know, a group of people who look like they've got good experience and then all sitting on the board for 9 years. You know, it needs a more dynamic approach to what it is that a board is there to do, and those kind of things. So
I think I totally agree with you, Scarlett. And actually, you know, I won't make you two blush, but the industry is ripe for disruption at the moment. You know, you look at the executive search industry, it is appalling, because it's mirroring the problem rather than the solution. And I know, because I've been asked to support the Park Review, and I'm currently not doing so because it's mirroring the problem. And it's not that nobody's asking the right question to the right people, because if they did, you would end up with a very different answer, and an answer people probably wouldn't like. But, you know, and to the first question, when people talked about the diversity, with clients or potential candidates, and especially CEOs, and I've had it to myself and chairman, saying, I'm not going to compromise quality for diversity. What they're really saying is, I don't think there's a single person of colour out there who could do this job. And if they really believe that, they shouldn't be running the business.
Yeah. Completely, absolutely, completely.
But the problem is, a lot of people will nod and go, I totally agree with you, we shouldn't. And that there is the problem.
And that there, Tony, is what we're writing a blog about over the course of the next week, is tokenism.
Sorry.
You're diving into the, well, we'll ask you back for the call about, video call about that one.
It's also probably important to give a last mention out to the importance of the CEO's attitude here as well. I think Tony referred to it earlier. I've seen a number of cases where the board chairs actually are quite supportive of changing the mix, and the CEO has objected to it, because sometimes a CEO has said to me, I'm uncomfortable with an inexperienced board director 10 years younger than me hauling me over the coals and challenge me on my strategy and business performance. Right, so
they've got to be comfortable
there as well.
That they're not in Finland then, with
we just need to take into account. Yeah, it really is both the board chair and the CEO, that if the two of them genuinely buy into the value of having a real vibrant, dynamic board with a great mix, then it will happen. They're the two.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Kieran. Well, thank you, both of you, for joining us to chat through this. I mean, the thought of having a better mix of people on boards really excites us, and that's why we started Dynamic Boards. And for anyone that's watching this that hasn't had a look at our site yet, we've shown over 400 non-executive director vacancies, that's paid board roles on UK boards, since we launched in May. And we add more every week, so please do have a look. And we'll be posting a blog on tokenism next week. And Kieran and Tony, if you're up for having a chat about that one, it'd be good to chat with you again and hear your thoughts there. But thank you so much and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.